Hello, everybody. This is Eli Lake again, and I am joined today with Daniel Larison, who is with the American Conservative and has just completed the defense of his PhD in Byzantine history at the University of Chicago. Thank you very much for coming on here today, Daniel.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Eli. It's good to talk to you.
Good to talk to you. But before we start talking about the debate, I would just like to say something to Joe the plumber if he's watching.
Yeah.
No one's going to raise your taxes, Joe.
Right.
In fact, the U.S. government is going to continue to spend money in debt as long as the Chinese, Indians, and Japanese are willing to show up at bond auctions. So if you'd really like to keep your taxes lower, buy stuff that's made in China, because the recession's probably going to hit them too. So just a note to Joe the plumber who's out there.
Yeah, well,
anyway,
and he is the most important person in the country right now, so that's an important
I
thing
really
to say.
didn't know. I was sort of beside myself because it was like McCain had the idea of addressing Joe the plumber directly, and then Obama started doing it. It was like I'd never seen anything like that. I was trying to imagine if the two presidential candidates in a debate addressed Eli Lake, or like, "Hey, Eli Lake, I just want to tell you something," with millions of people watching. How weird is that?
No, I know. It was a sort of escalating pandering. It got out of hand. I think people counted as many as 20 mentions of the guy's name, or just his first name, because we don't want to actually identify who he is.
Yeah. Joe the plumber has more influence than the unions, than AIPAC.
Yeah, right. No,
Joe the plumber is driving this election.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, not at all. So what did you think of the debate?
Well, it's hard from my perspective because I've watched so many of these things over the last year and a half that I can't imagine really caring that much about what they were saying. But I mean, I think in terms of just raw performance, McCain did better, although I guess he looked very irritated most of the time. But I think he did a better job in making his case and in trying to undermine the case for Obama a little bit more than he had done in previous debates, which was strange because this was the one debate where his supposed area of expertise or area of strength wasn't mentioned hardly at all, that being foreign policy. So,
well, yeah, I mean, I think it was designed that way. I mean, I thought, first of all, according to the instant sort of poll reactions, apparently people liked Obama.
Right.
I think as long as Obama kind of appeared plausible as president, which he did, it was nothing exciting, then Republicans and John McCain, fairly or unfairly, I think unfairly, are being blamed for the enormous financial crisis. And that seems to be it. That seems to be the big issue in the election, obviously. I mean, the Nikkei lost, 10% almost yesterday? I mean, it's a disaster.
Again, yeah, I mean, it's lost that much in several days, yeah.
Right, exactly. But so we're all getting, geometrically poorer, or at least our economies are shrinking by astounding measures, and I think that anxiety will translate into what I was looking like a sweep of the Democrats.
Right.
So the debate, I would say, McCain was more aggressive. I think he had the better of the two on the point of when they got into negative campaigning. I thought he made a good point about John Lewis and the fact that that both campaigns have kind of gotten this way. Though I think it's implausible that he says, well, if only you'd agreed to so many town hall debates, then I wouldn't have run negative ads. I just think that's ridiculous. But
yeah, and as someone was saying, if they had actually had 10 town hall debates, we would have all forced them to stop long before this.
Well, yeah, and there were some gaffes. I caught. At one point, McCain said Justice Breyer,
yes.
You voted for, what is that supposed to mean? I thought Obama should have said, because he said I was 8 years old when the Weather Underground bombed the Pentagon or something. So he said, well, I was 22 years old when Justice Breyer was appointed to the Supreme Court.
Yeah, right.
Something like that. But he didn't catch him on that. I'm trying to think if there were a few other things. There were some verbal gaffes. At one point, I think he said a breath of fresh air.
Yes, yeah, he was getting.
I mean, I do that. That's fine.
He was getting a bit flustered at that point because, and there were these sort of looks of disbelief whenever Obama would deny one of his accusations, as if it was impossible to deny. But one of the advantages that Obama has had is that I think he's learned since the first debate to just stop trying to correct whatever, or stop trying to get into a back and forth with McCain. He'll simply, if there's an accusation, he'll simply deny it and move on. And he's managed to avoid getting pulled into these, I guess, the traps that McCain's trying to set for him a lot better that way.
Right. It does. McCain's campaign does have this sort of a pirate ship feel to it. I kind of get the impression that that McCain listens to his best friends, Joe Lieberman and Lindsey Graham, and doesn't really listen to the rest of the campaign. Because, I mean, it doesn't make any sense. If you're going to go after Ayers, which I think is completely legitimate, you should go after Jeremiah Wright. I mean, I don't understand why Jeremiah Wright wouldn't be legitimate, but Bill Ayers would be.
Right. Well, in fact, it makes the entire line of character attack make even less sense, because you can at least make the case that Obama had some strong affiliations or strong connections with Wright personally and possibly politically in terms of the way that he looks at
money
things.
to his church.
Right.
Right.
And with Ayers, the connection is a great deal more tenuous, so it ends up seeming much less credible to even go into that direction if you're not going to talk about the much stronger connection.
Yeah, well, let's get into this, because this is you'd recently written something based on Connor Friedsdorf, and I hope I'm pronouncing that right.
I think so, yeah.
And I like Connor, but I thought Connor's piece about the Ayers stuff is really a way to try to tar. I mean, first of all, why don't you summarize your point about what McCain is trying to do with what you think McCain is trying to do with bringing up Ayers?
Right. Well, But what Connor was saying in a post at Culture 11 was that simply by associating the word terrorist with Obama, that he was conjuring up or he or Palin was conjuring up in the public's mind their image of what terrorists usually are, which would be Islamist terrorists or Al Qaeda, and so this was, in the way that Connor was putting it, this is a way of framing your political opponents as associates of terrorists, in general.
Garden variety Marxian terrorists.
Well, right.
Yeah.
And so I think this is. I think Connor has a point to the extent that in talking about Iraq or in talking about foreign policy generally, there has been this rhetoric that Obama wants to surrender or capitulate, or that his withdrawal plans in Iraq are the equivalent of capitulating to terrorism. So, to the extent that that link has already, or that argument has already been made, I think Connor has a point that raising connections to any kind of terrorist are going to make people go in that direction and associate Obama with much more menacing or more current day terrorists. And I think we saw some of this in the way that some of Obama's critics on the right were trying to spin the so-called Hamas endorsement against Obama and say that this
I think Hamas withdrew their endorsement.
They did, yeah. After he said a certain number of things.
Who are Hamas sympathizers going to vote for in this election? I don't know. Maybe Cynthia McKinney, Bob Barr.
I think she might have a chance of getting them. Yeah.
Right.
But I mean, of course, the whole talk about Hamas endorsing Obama was sort of strange, because why would anyone pay attention one way or the other to who they endorsed? But it was being taken in connection with one of Obama's very peripheral advisors when Robert Malley was associated with his campaign, because Robert Malley had meetings with Hamas in a different context, that this somehow implied that Obama was open or sympathetic to the idea of talking to Hamas, which he had repeatedly denied wanting to do.
Well, I mean, the campaign said Malley's not part of the campain.
Well, right, and they dropped him, or they severed any ties immediately after that.
Right, but then there was that letter from Dennis Ross and Martin Indyk and the other kind of solons of Democratic foreign policy, Middle East policy, who said Malley's all right with me.
Yeah, right.
I mean, I don't think. I mean, listen, Malley can do what he wants to do. it's interesting that a campaign, and this was during the primary, for the Democratic primary, did not want to be associated with Malley's view, which is, I think, he does favor his U.S. policy, pressure on Israel and for the U.S. to begin negotiations with Hamas, and for that matter, Hezbollah. And I'd say that it's kind of in line with a group called Conflicts Forum, which seeks to bring European and Western journalists and policymakers and intelligence people in touch with representatives of, I would say, kind of Islamic supremacist light organizations, not directly like sort of the bowels of al-Qaeda, but certainly what they would call a kind of moderate wing of the Taliban in Pakistan. They've worked with, the Conflicts Forum worked on the failed British talks with, I think, the Pakistani Taliban and the Afghan Taliban. They have worked with Hezbollah and other groups. And so, I'm saying that this may win you elections in Europe, but if that is going to be the U.S. policy, it would be so surreptitiously because Obama has clearly rejected, and his campaign has rejected this approach, on numerous occasions, even during the primary when he was much more dovish on Iraq than he is during the general. Wouldn't you say?
Yes. Well, I think yes. He's been much more, I guess you could say, more consistent in relation to his public positions on Israel and on anything connected to Israel than he has been on Iraq.
Well, on Iraq, he promises to leave an untold number of reserve forces in the country. He wants to negotiate the status of forces, which is what Bush's position is,
right,
and what McCain's position is. So I don't really actually see much daylight between Obama's position on Iraq at this point and the McCain or Bush position on even I'm in favor of negotiating with an elected Iraqi government the status of American forces in the country for their long-term presence or not. If the Iraqis, or the elected Iraqi government says we don't want you here, then I don't see any reason why we should stay there. So I don't think that's going to happen. But Obama's position on Iraq, on Pakistan, Afghanistan, on even Iran, where he's been criticized by McCain for in the primary debate saying he wouldn't have a problem meeting with Ahmadinejad. But he's now backed away from that. He now says, well, I would have lower level diplomatic kind of, interested in sort of diplomatic meetings with them before, without preconditions to see if there was a possible grand bargain. Some Iran watchers think that's possible. I don't. But then he's also not taking any military options off the table, which I think would probably you probably would disagree with that. And he's pledged that he's sort of made the kind of, I think, a pretty unequivocating pledge that he wouldn't allow Iran to go nuclear. So that's not that different from Bush, who sent William Burns to Geneva to hear out the latest Iranian, back and forth in July. So
right.
I don't see there's not much difference there either.
And actually, this is a point where I think we actually agree in our assessment of Obama's foreign policy. Although I think we. Well,
it's what he says. You go, and then I have a caveat.
Right. But my response to what Obama is proposing to do, or what he says that he wants to do, I assume is or in fact, I'm pretty sure is very different from your response. But I agree entirely that there's been a great deal of convergence, even on those issues where there seemed to be any meaningful difference on Iraq, which is why it's been interesting to me in previous debates why McCain has brought up this idea that Obama wants to withdraw without paying attention to conditions or without paying attention to what military commanders say, when he specifically includes those qualifications in his statements.
Well, he does now.
Well, he does now, and he started doing that earlier in the summer. That was his moment when he was refining his policies.
When he pivoted on this question, he basically got to where I think I don't think there's many policy options on Iraq right now. I think that I think any president would be insane to futz around with what appears to be working right now, and on a similar point, I would argue with maybe a hard right position that says, we should keep troops in Iraq regardless of what the Iraqi government says. There should be a negotiation. It should be probably with a government ultimately, at least for a status of forces long-term agreement. It might be even better to have that with a government that is a result of the elections at the end of 2009, because that government will be in power, and I think those elections will be a bit freer than the ones in 2005.
Right.
But back to Obama, and this sort of relates to the Bill Ayers stuff. I guess I have a few points on this. One is that the implication that it's Nixon land, and I just want to say something to all these bloggers out there that are referring to McCain, trolling in Nixon land. Have you seen this, by the way, based on the Rick Perlstein book? Do you know what I'm talking about?
I know.
Yeah, everyone's like, it's Nixon land all over again, right? And the implication is that he's like bugging the DNC headquarters or something like that. I'm going to start using Mondale land, okay? It's ridiculous. It's not Nixon land, okay? If John McCain served on 2 charitable boards with a sort of unrepentant abortion clinic bomber who then went into education to, further his agenda because he didn't want to, he realized that his methods and tactics were wrong, but his sort of basic ideology was correct, we wouldn't hear the end of that. And I think that Ayers is legitimate, not to say that, of course Obama doesn't support, he's not a terrorist, he doesn't support terrorism. I think that part is, and anybody who implies that, and I think Sarah Palin skated very close to the line when she said pals around with unrepentant terrorists. Right. But that said, it's a data point to make, and even though I don't necessarily agree that Obama is a radical, this is a contested presidential election, and it's very fair to sort of say this guy's past associations seem to be with a very hard radical left that he's not right now projecting as. In fact, he's downright Clintonian. I mean, he's saying he supports charter schools. He wants to give everyone tax cuts, or at least most people tax cuts. He also says he wants a line item veto. That was a Reagan. Remember, Reagan wanted a line item veto. Right. He was talking about a line item veto last night in the debate. So he's certainly campaigning in almost a center-right way if you look at the grand sweep of American liberalism. But in the 90s, and when he was in the state legislature, and when he was in Hyde Park, maybe it was a function of the fact that a lot of leftist radicals live in Hyde Park, but he certainly had these associations and affiliated himself with people that would he doesn't, at least he's not articulating those views now. So that seems to be completely fair to bring that up as someone campaigning against him, saying, listen, is this guy who he really says he is? Because only 7 years ago or 8 years ago or 10 years ago, this is who he was hanging around with, and this is what he was doing.
Right. No, I agree that. I think it's fair to bring it up. What I think the pattern in Obama's career shows, which somewhat undermines the attempting to tie him or tying him to more radical people that he knew here in the neighborhood, is that he will tend to bend towards whatever the prevailing opinion is in the place that he is in a given point in his career. So, one of the things that drives me up the wall, actually, about a lot of his supporters is that they will talk endlessly about his speech that he gave back in 2002 against the war, as if a state senator from Hyde Park could have done anything else.
See, that's interesting. And you live in Hyde Park, is that right?
I do, yeah. Yeah.
So are there a lot of Maoist flags and stuff? I'm astounded. Everything I read about Hyde Park, I was under the impression that in 1968, Mayor Daley beat back those yippies. But the yippies returned in Hyde Park, apparently. You know what I'm saying? And now they're running the universities.
Well, not entirely. The picture that a lot of people are getting of the neighborhood over the last few months as this sort of almost, I don't know, socialist commune or something else.
Yeah, and it seems like that's exactly. It seems like it's always 1968 in Hyde Park.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's really. That really doesn't capture what it's like here.
Are there drum circles? Do you have to tell drum circles to just cut it out?
No.
Several hacky sack stores.
In fact, there are the number of actual political protests or demonstrations that I've seen on campus can be numbered on one hand. It's people have actually a wide array of political views in the student body and in the faculty, and
Cass Sunstein, for example.
and I think and I think the university attracts people who like having that sort of intellectual diversity. And don't mind mixing it up with people.
The economics department were Milton Friedman. I mean,
yes, and of course
the world.
That's one of the big controversies here at the university now, as the university is trying to set up the Milton Friedman Institute, and a lot of faculty members who are not fans of Friedman, not fans of his politics or his economics, are
who favor state planning in the economy and stuff.
Right, they're organizing. There was a letter written by a number of faculty. There have been, I guess, meetings on campus to protest or to
really
challenge or maybe not challenge, but to question the administration's creation or support for this institute. But the fact that something like the Milton Friedman Institute can be proposed and is probably going to be established here in our socialist commune, I think that complicates the picture of what Hyde Park is like. And so I understand the reason why people are trying to make the neighborhood seem really strange and foreign to people, because that way Obama will seem more strange to them. But I mean, the other thing to remember is that Obama's not really from here. He came here and acclimated himself to the place. But it's not, even if there were things even if the accusations about Hyde Park were true, it wouldn't necessarily entirely reflect on him.
Well, I grew up in Philadelphia in a neighborhood called Germantown, which was also fairly, there are a lot of co-ops there.
Right.
It was a fairly lefty place. So I can kind of identify with that. And I lived for years in Adams-Morgan in Washington, which was also not quite. It wasn't quite like Hyde Park in terms of. We didn't have any Weather Underground people living in Adams-Morgan, and I liked living in the city. So that's not necessarily a strike against them. And I certainly agree that you can be from a neighborhood and then disagree with whether prevailing politics. But it is. I had actually seen, I'm a little bit on the conservative side, so I've kind of had a little bit of I've had an interest in the past about the Weather Underground, so I saw the documentary and I read up about them. And I think that the main thing is it's sort of a lot of people are sort of how did these people who, took up arms against the government manage to rehabilitate their careers in such a way that Bernadine Dorn I guess she's at Northwestern Law School, Bill Ayers is an education professor. I'm saying, how does that happen? And I think that that's part of it as well.
Right. No, yeah, I think, there's certainly I guess, more of a tolerance for left-wing opponents or even, in this case, you call them rebels against the government. And I think that does reflect, the general or prevailing political views here. So that, while it is a diverse neighborhood, there's still definitely a strong left-leaning feel to the whole place. One of the things that I always remark on to people from back home in New Mexico is that around here you can go around and on any given day you're going to find a bumper sticker that says, "I'd rather be smashing imperialism." I think that smashes that idea of smashing imperialism being sort of a commonplace notion is indicative of the kind of ideas that would flourish here that probably wouldn't people wouldn't advertise in lots of other places.
Not a lot of recruitment for the armed services there.
Well, I'm not sure about that. I'm not sure whether there is or not actually. I'm not sure how many people would take them up on it if there was. Right.
Interesting. Well, how do you react? I mean, you're a paleoconservative. You've written a lot about empire.
Right.
You're against it. But I think you have also. I mean, you are kind of a quirky. I don't want to say it in a bad way. You're conservative. do you feel like it's an inhospitable place? I mean, where you've gone to grad school and stuff?
Not at all.
Right. And you sort of fit in. Or not fit in, but...
Yeah, and one of the reasons... I mean, one of the nice things about the university and is that even if your professor's politics are much more to the left of yours, or not, there's not the kind of stigma or pressure. Or at least I don't feel that pressure, and there's no effort to really push a certain political agenda on the students or on people
right.
in social settings. So,
what would be the political agenda of Byzantine history, though? I don't know.
I'm not sure that there would be one. I think the Megali idea, to recreate the Byzantine Empire has had its day. So I don't think most Byzantinists would be sympathetic to that idea anyway. I mean, it's a sort of a funny thing about people who study Byzantians that they seem to want to qualify what they're doing by stressing all the things about it that they don't like. We don't like that it was theocratic. We don't like that it was authoritarian.
Mm-hmm.
But it was still interesting, so we should study it. And so it's... but, I mean, it's a fascinating subject.
Okay. All right, well, let's... I guess we can... Well, there was one more point I wanted to make.
Sure.
So let me bounce this off you. It's about the recent attacks on the McCain campaign, which seems to be sort of a pace of what I sort of associate with the resurgent liberal left, which is that, and you've seen this with McCain and also against Bush in some cases, which is I call it kind of the semiotic critique, which is that it doesn't actually matter what McCain or the campaign says. It's that the images of Obama are spliced with images of Britney Spears, who's a white woman and he's a black man, and therefore it's kind of tickling the reptilian brain of the viewer in such a way to sort of associate him with ugly racist stereotypes. Or what a different version of this would be that Bush kept saying Al Qaeda and Iraq in the same sentence, even though he never directly said that Saddam Hussein was responsible for 9/11. He said he couldn't take the risk of him giving weapons of mass destruction to Al Qaeda, which is a very different kind of claim. But nonetheless, it was an effort to try to associate the two, and therefore it's sort of this. It is a kind of semiotic political critique, which I think is dangerous, and I would hate for conservatives to sort of play this game because when you start making your points against your political opponent based on these kinds of symbolic interpretations, which I think in some cases are rather dubious on sort of the merits, you are losing the plain meaning of language. And I would, as somebody who has an interest in seeing a more elevated debate than we've seen in this political cycle, we've seen for some time, I would much rather have, the campaign sort of say, you said this, why did you say this, and then kind of keep it on the textual and not subtextual level. I don't know what you think.
Right. Well, no, I think, I'll come back to the Iraq question in a second. Mm-hmm. But I think, actually, when it comes to McCain's ads, we're probably mostly in agreement here that the idea that there were messages encoded or that there was supposed to be some sort of nod to fears of miscegenation in the celebrity ad.
Right. Or the Franklin Rains ad, or there's all this stuff that, and it's totally encouraged among my mainstream media folks,
right?
To write this sort of thing, and it seems like it's just tripe. And I was thinking about myself doing a kind of parody column along the lines of how Obama is sort of signaling how dangerous it is to have an Eskimo Yupik second gentleman, and how a lot of his ads are really semiotically against snow peoples.
Right. No,
I mean, just to say, because I don't really think McCain is. I mean, actually, an interesting thing for our liberal viewers to look at, if they want to say that McCain is sort of playing to very ugly passions of racism and a racial caste system in this country, which obviously I think we both reject. McCain gave a really moving, and he didn't have to do this on Martin Luther King's birthday. He addressed At I think that Memphis hotel, he addressed a black audience of Southern Baptist leaders and said he apologized for when he was in the 80s opposing making it a national holiday. I mean, I don't think McCain is a racist guy. I don't think he's playing to that.
Right, and it was something that I was saying back when the furor over his celebrity ad, and then the ad. I guess it was in the celebrity ad that there were also pictures of Obama's Berlin speech, which some really bizarre interpretations were made about that, saying that it was
something Hitler.
Yeah, it was some sort of homage to Triumph of the Will, which was crazy. I mean, it made no sense. And so I was saying at the time
and frankly, even bringing up Jeremiah Wright, that I think is a very legitimate. I mean, that's legitimate. He was in the church for 20 years. Now he's rejected Jeremiah Wright in the campaign season, but he, it's not racist to bring that up because Jeremiah Wright is not indicative of all. That's not he's not the avatar of American Black Christianity.
Right. Well, and I would I would think that people wouldn't want to make him into that either.
Right.
So I was saying at the time when the celebrity ad was being attacked along these lines that what McCain was doing during the campaign was possibly misrepresenting or distorting Obama's record on certain policy questions. I thought he was doing that with Obama's Iraq position in order to create a difference between them, where there wasn't much of one left. But that when it came to all of these accusations of race baiting, that they were essentially unfounded, and it required this kind of incredible interpretation of these cues that are supposed to be embedded in the ads that no one could see if they weren't looking for them for the purpose of attacking McCain.
Yeah.
And the thing is, these cues, there's no consistent system to these cues. If they put Obama in an ad with a white woman, that is supposed to spur one kind of fear. If they put him in an ad with Reigns, that is supposed to spur another fear. Essentially, you're not. It seems like the safe thing to do would be never put Obama in any of the ads.
Right. Well, I mean, let me just say this one thing, which is not a criticism in any way of McCain. There are racists in America who won't vote for Obama because he's a black guy, and they're probably, if they were to vote, and some of them will, they'll vote for McCain. But I don't think McCain is encouraging people to be racist. I just think, you gotta have, everybody knows that. There are lots of ignorant. That's the thing. That's the other thing, is that someone at a rally who says kill him or he's an Arab or something like that, we all join everyone in denouncing that kind of verbal thuggery. But at the same time, if we're going to start judging the campaigns and candidates on their supporters, then Democrats have a lot to lose themselves. I mean, should we judge Democratic leaders based on, for example, I don't know, comments on Huffington Post saying they wish the suicide bomber had killed Dick Cheney? No. I don't think I don't think Harry Reid or Nancy Pelosi wishes, that terrorists killed the vice president. But, there are some there's some wackadoos on the internet who did. So what? I mean, it's a big country.
Right. No.
Right.
Right. And you actually, it's a strange thing, because on the one side you see a lot of liberal bloggers. I think Matt Iglesias was saying this about the Ayers question.
Yeah.
That because the connection with Ayers is fairly tenuous, then you have to go through.
I don't know if it's so tenuous, but okay.
It
is what it is. It's not like they're best friends. We know that, but
Right, but the thrust of his argument was the connection with Ayers was so tenuous that you'll end up implicating every politician with anybody he's ever met. I mean, that was the sort of argument that Iglesias was making, and yet at the same time, there will be the criticism of McCain for having some random supporter in a crowd that he'd never even met. For shouting these things out, and so there are different standards of
politics of association for me, but not for thee, or for thee, but not for me.
Yeah,
right?
Essentially, yeah.
Right. Yeah, no, it's unfortunate. I mean, I thought the height of this was actually during the primary season when some more liberal lefty writers wrote an open letter to one of the networks saying how ridiculous it was to bring up Jeremiah Wright in the primary debate. And I'm like, oh, come on. I'm saying, if this had been, if McCain, had gone for 20 years to Hagee's church, for example, and dedicated a book to him and called Hagee a spiritual advisor, then they wouldn't stop talking about it. You know what I'm saying?
Right. I mean, I imagine they wouldn't. Although it seems to me that one of the things that has been interesting about the way that Hagee and McCain were treated is that in my opinion, the more important connection between Hagee and McCain is that they have similar views on policy, and Hagee is an influential leader of a growing lobbying force in the Capitol. So it seemed like it would be more consequential if there was a connection between Hagee and McCain in terms of what McCain might actually do once president than with some of these others. But no, I take your point that if McCain had been learning or receiving religious instruction at the feet of this guy, he would. I probably would have ended his campaign actually, because between the anti-Catholic and questionable statements about Jews and about various other peoples, it would be very hard to escape the backlash against that.
Indeed. All right, well, we actually have some more time. We could continue to talk about Obama and William Ayers and the Weather Underground, but we could either get into Afghanistan, Pakistan, or we could talk about, we have a little bit of a beef. Do you want to talk about Mearsheimer and the American Conservative and Paleocon v. Neocon? You want to mix it up? In a civil way. This has been a very good conversation. We're not going to, there's not going to be a yelling and screaming.
Yeah, I think the folks at Blogging Heads have been disappointed so far.
But, well, I don't think so. I think I don't know. I have a theory about Blogging Heads, having done a couple of them. But you get a viral video if people start screaming and insulting each other.
Right.
But I think the hardcore Blogging Heads viewer likes a reasoned, respectful conversation.
Yeah, well, I know that I do when I'm watching.
Yeah.
Well, I think we'll aspire to keep it that way.
There's other places on the internet if they want to go for screaming and hollering.
Right.
Yeah.
And actually, I think we can touch on both because I think there are some common threads running through both the Pakistan subject and then getting back to Israel and
Let's get into Israel because I have to say,
all right,
respectfully, I think your magazine is sort of obsessed in a bizarre way with a theory of the Bush administration, which has it that neoconservatives undermined the national interest to launch the war in Iraq, and there seems to be, and you've printed Justin Raimondo, who I think is a fringe figure, whose first book after 9/11 was look into the Israeli connections to the 9/11 attacks. This is wacky stuff. And it just seems to sort of be, it gets a lot of ink in your magazine. And Giraldi is another one. Giraldi, after the revelations in the, in that book by Ron Suskind that just came out over the summer, wrote a blog post that said, I've got it on authority that this, first of all, Suskind's thing looks like it's been shot down by his alleged sources. But more importantly, he says, no, Susskind got it wrong. It was Doug Feith. It's always Doug Feith with the American Conservative. It's always Feith and Wolfowitz. And what's going on there?
Well, a couple things. One, okay. I think the argument that most of us who worked there and most of us who subscribe to it or read the magazine want to advance is, first of all, that we think the Iraq War is not in the American national interest, and so there was that. Right. But I mean that's where it starts.
Right. Okay.
And so
All right.
and so then the question became who was the most or who seemed to be the most fervent or zealous advocates of going into Iraq, deposing Hussein, and why are they doing that? And so I think the paleo critique, although it seems like this critique has spread out and gained adherents in lots of different places now.
Yes, like the far left. Yeah.
Right. Well, and not even the far left, but I mean, even to some extent in Mearsheimer-Walt's book, and
right.
among some
beloved
progressive
by
realists,
the far left and the paleocons, right?
Right. So what the argument was, or this is the way that I would state it, is that because neoconservatives see Israeli and American interests as being so close to one another, or being so complementary, that what are the proper security interests of America got lost or got conflated with those of Israel in a way that I think, as Mearsheimer and Walt would say, were actually damaging to the real interests of both countries. And so it becomes to some extent a question about how those security interests are defined. And so I think one of the reasons why paleocons keep running into why the whole situation perplexes me is that the argument is that Israel is supposed to be one of our firmest, most staunch allies, and if the Iraq War, in the view of its supporters, is in fact helping the security of Israel, why would that be considered a smear to say that people were taking the security interests of Israel into serious consideration in supporting the war, or even as a major reason for supporting the war?
Okay, well, a couple things. One, I think neoconservatives, and plenty of liberal internationalists, I might add, including Bill Clinton, supported the Iraq War because they believed that Iraq was a threat to American interests and regional interests. There were also a number of Israeli people who were sort of at the elite of their defense and security establishment who believed that the Iraq War was unnecessary, and that had they had their druthers, they would have sought for the U.S. to take firmer action against Iran, which they saw as their immediate threat. So what's interesting is that the people in Israel, for the most part, who are sort of there to sort of determine Israel's national interest, and I think actually there's an interesting quote from Mearsheimer before he got into all this stuff, where he said Israelis are the most realist people, or something like he sort of in foreign policy realism terms than he knew. Neoconservatives had a lot of ideas, but I think that the critique goes off the rails when we see the repetition of a discredited notion that the neoconservatives in the government somehow tampered with or pressured an intelligence reading that would portray Saddam Hussein as a threat, and that this was I think, and I've said this before, but just to sort of sum up, this was in a lot of different parties' interests for different reasons. Democratic lawmakers who voted for the war wanted an out. So they could say, hey, the intelligence was tampered with or pressured, and I was going on that intelligence, and had I known the real story, I wouldn't have voted for the war, which was politically plausible within their own party among certain groups who wanted to believe this. Then I think the intelligence community, who got a lot of this wrong, wanted to fob this off on political pressure, and they clearly won a kind of bureaucratic political debate in that a lot of the people who've staffed the new Directorate of National Intelligence, which came out of the 9/11 Commission, were clearly of the sort of bureaucratic, view that, like, hey, that Paul Pilar is out of government, but a lot of his protégés did quite well bureaucratically. So there was that interest. And then, finally, there's a kind of group of people would sort of say, we're adhering too closely to Israel's interest, and that's why we're in this, disastrous war and so forth. I think that Richard Perle, and I know them, Wolfowitz and Feith, made an argument based on American interests. And what Walton Mearsheimer did in their study and their book was to say that Wolfowitz and Feith and Perle, more Wolfowitz and Feith, who were part of the U.S. government, were in fact also part of a lobby for a foreign government, which is where we kind of get into our dispute from, I think, a year ago when I was on Blogging Heads, and you wanted a critique of me saying I was slandering the professors. And I guess I don't see how that's that different from sort of accusing them of being in some ways a foreign agent. If you were to say that, an assistant secretary of state or something like that is really a Russian lobbyist, then that's saying basically that they shouldn't be in government. And I think that is shifting the grounds of debate into fairly ugly territory. Now, I think both of us would agree, and conservatives generally would agree, that it's important to be vigilant against espionage and against and to defend the national interest. But the national interest in America is also a conversation. And when you have an adversary, an intellectual or political adversary on this topic who says, no, I think the national interest requires us to do X, Y, and Z, and you think it's A, B, and C, to say that the guy saying the other thing is really not arguing in good faith about the American national interest, is really just arguing about the Israeli national interest, is it's fairly ugly. And I don't think it should be part of. I think it's already proven. With the exception of Daniel Levy, I don't think that book got any good reviews.
Well, no, it's true. It didn't get many good reviews. I think in our magazine it did, but
exactly, the American Conservative gave it a very good review.
Well, yeah,
right.
But that's true. There were not many good reviews. It was
right,
and I think it was. Where I think the critics were right is that they didn't take into account the role that other lobbies in the interests of other foreign governments in the region also wield tremendous influence and sometimes countervailing influence. And I think that part of the story does need to be told to get a better picture of why
it's rewriting history to say that in 2002 and it's from the late 1990s to the early aughts that the consensus view among intelligence agencies and the consensus political view, regardless of what the neoconservatives said, was that Saddam was amassing an arsenal of weapons of mass destruction. The fact that that was wrong is not because neoconservatives mucked around with the intelligence process. And in fact, a lot of the whistleblowers, Karen Kwiatkowski, Joe Wilson, these folks, were not able to at least produce the stories they told journalists under oath when it was investigated by the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. And even the Rockefeller Phase 2 Committee report, which was looking at what the intelligence product said versus what Bush said and the top administration officials, found that in most cases, now there were of course exceptions. When Cheney said he thought that that Mohammed Atta had met with the Iraqi intelligence official in Prague, for example.
Right. And when
he said that was not what the FBI and the CIA were telling him. But in most cases, that Saddam had an active nuclear program, for example, even that Saddam Hussein was knowingly allowing throughout the entire country, not just northern Iraq, al-Qaeda to sort of establish safe haven and cells in the country. And that's relevant, keep in mind, because in 2002, Lawrence Foley, the USAID administrator for Jordan, was murdered by Zarqawi's cell. That even those statements, which were, for a long time seen as something that the CIA was sort of against, and it's a complicated thing, we can get into the details of it, but even in those cases, that was sort of seen as a sort of the consensus intelligence. The Carl Ford, in a memo to Colin Powell before his presentation, said, "We have reason to believe that al-Qaeda is establishing cells throughout Iraq with Saddam's knowledge." I'm paraphrasing, but it's in the Rockefeller report. So a lot of that, a lot of the initial sort of scandalous stories about what about the State Department descent on the aluminum tubes and like what that's turned. That's been largely debunked. The Niger uranium stuff. That was in the Butler report, said that MI6 had very good reason to believe that. And President Bush, in his famous 16 words, referenced British intelligence. So all these things that the left and the Paleocons were, just tearing their hair out about a few years back, have turned to be sort of molehills and not the mountains they said.
Well, yeah, there are a few things to get to.
Yeah.
So, on the question of tampering with intelligence, I think that point can be pressed too far. What I don't think is really debatable is that the people in the administration took the intelligence that they had and they emphasized only those things that fit with their preconceived assumptions about the Iraqi threat and dismissed anything that might have cast doubt on it. And then they presented the case to the public as if there were no doubts, as if it were absolutely certain.
I don't know. I think basically what's interesting here is that the original critique was that bunk Shalaby information was stovepiped through the system and became sort of the part of the public product. And the ending argument, after we sort of know a lot more about this process, because there's been a lot of investigations of it, is that critics like yourself would have rather had the few dissents that there were stovepiped above what was largely considered to be a consensus. And that is, like, if you read, like, for example, Woodward's book, there was a lot of faith from Tenet about, this sort of slam-dunk case, largely because they believed that they had sources very close to the, sort of inner circle of Saddam Hussein that they called rock stars that were telling him this stuff. And that, there were all kinds of things like this that sort of have come up, and I've sort of always wondered, like, all right, well, now that the new information has come out, I certainly, I wrote about the difference, by the way, of intelligence between the CIA and the Pentagon about Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And I know that Richard Clarke obviously was asked about this, and he said he didn't think there was much of a connection. It turns out that, of course, Saddam Hussein didn't have much of a role in 9/11, but the review of the Iraqi archives showed that Saddam had, at times been willing to work with at least affiliates of Al-Qaeda and Islamist groups, despite the sort of long-standing argument that, this National Socialist could never work with jihadist organizations. Indeed, he was willing to do so when it advanced his agenda. I just think that whole argument about this sort of pre-war intelligence is pretty much a red herring, I would say. It said nothing. It didn't really kind of. It was. I think that the people who really were overhyping were the people who were like a Joe Wilson, for example. Like Joe Wilson is a hyper.
Right. Well, what I would. I think the larger complaint, or the more substantive complaint against the administration, because the worrying about or talking about the alleged manipulation of intelligence it becomes very much a procedural or almost so much of an insider question that almost isn't the most important part of the criticism of the administration. The really crucial, and I think it's hard to refute this, that the administration grossly exaggerated the nature of the threat when you had someone like Cheney going out on national television saying that Iraq's nuclear program had been reconstituted.
But that's what they believed. That's what the intelligence community believed, that they reconstituted their nuclear program.
But
now, Baradei didn't think that, but Baradei, keep in mind, I've made this point before, but Baradei and more importantly, the IAEA had missed a lot of key developments in nuclear programs in other places around that same time. There was no warning from the IAEA, for example, about Iran. There was no warning from the IAEA about North Korea. And Cheney was very chastened by the fact that before the Gulf War, he was told that that when the Israelis bombed Osirak, that they had set back and that Iraq didn't have much of a nuclear program. And then what they found afterwards is that they did have a nuclear program. So there was a combination of things that were going on there. But in fact, there was a lot. The intelligence community believed that. And by the way, so did the Clinton administration. It was like the guys who Democrats they didn't obviously invade Iraq, but, Operation Desert Fox and all these other things that Clinton ended up allowing to pass. At least he didn't sign, but he didn't veto the Iraq Liberation Act. These things were there was quite a bit of history there on this stuff, and at the time, it's interesting that a lot of this stuff was wrong, and you can question the judgment and so forth, but the initial argument about this, the cell and the cabal within the government, that was, all this stuff is just, I don't know. It's like a John Grisham novel, Daniel. It is. It's like current events as Grisham-esque current events.
What you were saying about Cheney, I think goes to part of the problem, which is that the people were approaching the situation in 2002 as if it were immediately after the Gulf War, as if the disarmament and the weapons inspections that had happened over the decade after the Gulf War had never taken place, or that the 4-year window between the weapons inspectors being expelled and 2002 were this all-important period when all of these programs were being reconstituted, when it seemed implausible, even with the sanctions regime breaking down, it seemed implausible that after all those years of the programs being dismantled, that they would be reassembled that quickly.
But they never. That's the whole point, though. They never dismantled, according to any of the unscum inspections. That was now. When in April 2003, or rather March 2003, when the decision to invade was made, that there was a process that was going on. But even Hans Blix said in his report, saying that these are the following disarmament tasks that have not been completed, and he never, and it's. I think it's, if you looked at what Saddam was doing at the time, he, for example, didn't allow his scientists to leave the country with their families, which was a condition of, by the way, the final resolution. He at one point threatened to shoot down, UAVs and surveillance planes. I think that there's a fairly. I don't think Saddam gave the impression that he was willing to comply. Bob Wright believes that there was this great opportunity that was missed because they had inspectors on the ground. I'm of the view that Saddam, having covered it at the time, was not doing that. But listen, you want to criticize the judgment. There are other arguments you can make about why it was bad to go into Iraq. But the argument that has been a focus of the American conservative has been that it was this, Likud faction in the government that made this war possible, and that was sort of in this dangerous time, and all this stuff, and it just seems it's like fever swamp territory. And I don't think that history will judge, by the way, that journalism or that sort of what was out there, what you guys were writing at the time, very well.
Okay.
All right, we're back. You want to respond to that point?
Sorry.
We were talking. Very civil conversation.
Yeah. I did want to get back to the point on Iraq, that yes, there are other arguments, and I think ultimately more important arguments about why going into Iraq was entirely unnecessary. And part of that is an assessment of what the threat from Iraq would have been, even if the administration's claims about the weapons had been true.
Okay, well, that's all right.
And that's something that I really wish that more anti-war people had been saying at the time, which is that even with those weapon programs intact, it seemed to me that containment or deterrence would still have prevailed. I understand the theory, or I've heard the argument made many times, that these governments are going to hand off these weapons to terrorist groups, and then those groups are going to use them. But I've never understood why a government would do that. I've never understood why a government would put all that time and all those resources into creating an extremely powerful weapon and then give it to a third party who...
Well, I can give you an answer on that. I tend to agree that I find it very difficult to believe First of all, we don't even know about suitcase nukes or something like that. But the argument is that if a state that had weapons of mass destruction but was a fairly weaker state than, say, the United States, wanted to create a spectacular attack but wanted to muddy the waters of culpability, then they would give it to a third party. I mean, this is the model of state terrorism and terrorism as statecraft in the Middle East for 40 years. You've seen, I mean, we see this a lot. I mean, countries, particularly in their wars with Israel, after they lost in the Six-Day War, and then in '73, I guess you could say they lost again, at least according to the original. Increasingly, terrorism was used against Israel with the support of states as a way of kind of coercive statecraft. And you could argue that not just against Israel. Terrorism has been used against Egypt. Terrorism. Now, in some cases, like the assassination of Anwar Sadat, that was from an indigenous group of Qutbists of Egyptian Islamic Jihad. But when there was an attempted assassination of Hosni Mubarak, the state of Sudan, which at the time was harboring al-Qaeda, was implicated in that. Iran uses terrorism to advance their statecraft. In Lebanon, they were implicated by an Argentine court and even Interpol in the attacks against the Israeli embassy and the AMIA Cultural Center. And it is believed by many in the U.S. government, and I think there's even court records on this, that they were involved in the Khobar Towers attack. But does the Iranian military do this? No, they have terrorist groups that they support that go forth and do this sort of thing.
But I think it becomes much harder to believe. It becomes much more implausible that governments are going to develop weapons of the kind that could cause mass devastation.
Yeah.
In that government's own country, of the kind that we're talking about in Iraq, and we just hand those off to agents who might very well resell them, or who might use them against you at some point, or use them to blackmail you. I can't imagine why a government would do that.
It depends on the relationship with the organization. Saddam Hussein clearly was not a sponsor in any meaningful sense of al-Qaeda or jihadist groups. He worked with al-Qaeda and jihadist groups to advance at times his statecraft. He worked with, for example, Egyptian Islamic Jihad when it was run by Zawahiri before they merged with al-Qaeda. He worked with, he was interested in recruiting suicide bombers against the Saudi royal family. But you're right. But in the case of Iran, for example, they do sponsor, and they probably feel that they have perhaps a controlling or sponsorship relationship with elements of Hezbollah that conduct international operations, as opposed to sort of the domestic political terror operations within Lebanon these days. It depends on sort of how you look at it. I don't think that state sponsorship is a sufficient model for explaining terrorism, obviously, which is a model that was developed at the end of the Cold War. Nor do I think, however, that the other view, that terrorism is something that's kind of a natural or organic response to, what have you, occupation or something like that, is sufficient either. I think it's a bit of a combination of both. And in the case of al-Qaeda, we know that they have sought weapons of mass destruction for a very long time. And, even George Tenet in his book, at least for the regards to Iran, says that Saif al-Adil, tried and failed to get, sort of Russian nuclear technology while he was there. I think he still is there. It's sort of it's unknown at this point. But, I think that the concern was that al-Qaeda seeks weapons of mass destruction, and Saddam Hussein is not necessarily a rational actor. He wasn't a rational actor when he invaded all of Kuwait, which was a disaster for him.
That becomes a very contested point, whether he was acting rationally. If he did not expect a massive response, and if he and he may have misinterpreted what the signals from Washington were,
right.
but he was, I think it's clear he was led to believe that we had no particular stake in whether or not he controlled Kuwait, and he took that signal seriously. Now, it turned out that signal was not true.
Well, the original point that Saddam made, as I understand it from reading the diplomatic cables and so forth that are now public, was that he was simply asking Glaspie about a disputed area of oil fields that is on the Kuwait-Iraqi border. That when he marched his army into Kuwait City, that was not what was discussed in the. I mean, maybe he thought he heard one thing. I mean, it's for the historians to determine this, but I don't think he was given a go-ahead to take over all of Kuwait. He was given a.
No, I don't mean to say that he was given the go-ahead, but he interpreted Washington's response to his interests in that particular area to signal an unwillingness to defend Kuwaiti claims about anything. So I think the assumption that he's not a rational actor, that he can't be deterred, is, especially if it hinges mainly on whether or not he invaded Kuwait, doesn't persuade me. Coming back to the state sponsorship question, I think then we can bring this around to Pakistan now, because I think Pakistan clearly is a state sponsor of terrorism. They have played both sides of the fence in terms of cultivating the Taliban, pretending to or partially fighting against the Taliban when they came under pressure from us. But obviously there are still close connections between members of the ISI and elements in the border regions and in Afghanistan.
It gets a little muddy, though. I mean, I'm generally with you, but it gets a little muddy when you consider the fact that the elements the ISI supports in Pakistan have tried to assassinate, former President Musharraf, did succeed in assassinating. So I think it's elements of the state. But you raise a great question, Daniel Larison. We can end on this point. Let me ask you this.
Okay.
Is Pakistan in a civil war? Is there a civil war in Pakistan?
It's... I would say... I would say no, because I think whether or not the civilian government is really in charge of anything, I think the Pakistani military remains in more or less unified control of
Islamabad.
At least in Islamabad.
But not the frontier provinces, we know.
No, definitely not those.
And also, at times at least, when there was the standoff at the Red Mosque, elements of, for periods, not, ultimately, the Red Mosque rebellion was, I guess, partially crushed and partially sort of negotiated an end to. But when you mentioned the thing about sort of cells within the ISI, yes, right. The leadership of the military, Kiani, is an ally of the United States and is against, I think, the Islamic supremacist factions within the country.
Right.
Can we say the same about when you kind of get into a finer grain of detail? And that is a question, which is to say, even though they do control territory, but it's the sort of the backwood, frontier provinces. But how much, influence do the Islamic supremacists have within these institutions themselves? And I think we are learning the hard way that they have quite a bit.
They have influence, and then there's also, I think, a lack of enthusiasm inside the military, and even with someone like Kayani, who sees the importance of fighting against these elements, but who I think it's his view that the Pakistanis have been doing too much of the fighting on one hand, but on the other they don't really want Americans coming into their country either to do the fighting. So there are these sort of conflicted impulses within the Pakistani military, even among those officers who are against the Taliban, who are against these sorts of terror attacks.
Well, with President Obama, they're not going to have much of a choice, it seems.
And that's something that I'm actually pretty concerned about. That it's going to seem as if they don't have a choice, and they may end up going into more full-fledged opposition or hostility. And I think that would be much more catastrophic than the sort of weird stalemate that we have right now. And I think you probably just saw the reports on the new National Intelligence Estimate about, or leaked reports about that on Pakistan, saying that between the effects of the financial crisis on Pakistan and the internal political instability, that Pakistan really is on the verge of disaster.
Yes.
And that's if that country were to come apart along all the fissures that have been in that country since the beginning, we would have so many more problems, and the Indians would have so many more problems that I can't even conceive of them. That's
true. That's a bad option, but it's also a bad option for Al-Qaeda to have a base in Waziristan and the other Fata provinces where they can continue to plot mass murder of civilians. So I agree with you. No, I think that it's we have to be very wary. If I'm chastened by one thing about the Iraq War experience, though I do think I should get some credit for some of my reporting before the war on the intelligence stuff, but I would say that always be aware that there are never like obvious choices, like you either do this or you do that. And in general for policy, there are always trade-offs, and I think you articulated a serious trade-off, and that obviously these things have to be sort of approached very delicately. But we can say that Obama has endorsed what has become Bush's policy at the end of his administration of these raids into Pakistan. And, I think that a lot of this will depend on the plausible deniability of the Pakistani government to say that it's going on. But it is indeed going on, so we'll see what happens.
Right. We will, although I am concerned with this rhetoric coming out of Islamabad that they will fire on our soldiers.
No, they're not going to do that.
They may not.
Then if they did, they'd get crushed.
But you have
their soldiers are getting fired on already by the Taliban forces there.
Right. But what you have are some of these tribes in the border areas that have been kept more or less quiescent, who for one reason or another may be stirred to throw in their lot with the Taliban and make the already difficult situation on the other side of the border even more difficult. And that's where I see the real problem being in these kinds of strikes that aren't really going to, or that are probably not going to eliminate the Al-Qaeda bases, much less eliminate the social and tribal basis for the Taliban.
Right.
So I'm not sure what the ultimate goal is. I mean, I understand why we're trying to make these raids, but I don't know how we think it's ever going to come to.
Well, I mean, with the capture of high-level Al-Qaeda people and the destruction of their training camps and, seizing reams of documents that give us further insight into their global network.
But is that within reach?
That we don't know. That's a good question. Is it possible? We have a technological advantage in these sorts of things. Our special forces are, I think, the best trained in the world, and also they have great gadgets. And if it's possible to buy off and turn some of the local population, which is a big, big if, then the chances for the success would be more. But I think that's the end goal is if it succeeds, that's the idea. You want to smash the network, you want to smash the organization.
Right.
But you're right. Is the question is it within reach? And we the two of us can't possibly know that. That's you got to be on the ground. You've got to be in the military. You've got to kind of be getting those reports to get that. And as a journalist, I hope to inform my readers and viewers in the future of the progress on such a thing. And I'm sure you will continue to comment. Anyway, Daniel, good dialogue.
Yeah, good dialogue.
Strong disagreements, remaining civil. Joe the plumber, if you're watching. Joe, I just want to talk to Joe the plumber for a second.
Right.
All right. Okay. So it's been real, man. Thanks.
Yeah.
Okay.
Great.
All right.
Thanks.
Bye.